our war session, I was interested in having you have a look at the right of abatement. So where tree branches or roots encroach into another property.
Yeah.
What's the process there, and what are your rights and so forth? The reason that I'm interested is that I recently had a situation like that, and you were actually able to steer me towards some useful information. But while I was looking around myself for the answer, what I noticed was that there seemed to be an enormous amount of confusion out there about the subject. So I thought
trees are an incredibly confusing area to start off with. First of all, because most tree-related issues are common law issues. And so they relate to cases and how those cases are applied. And there's some of those go back quite a while, several hundred years. So you end up with some weird anomalies that come through. For example, assuming I'm in an area where there is no tree protection legislation, no development control plan, or whatever it might be based on jurisdiction, then I can prune back branches that overhang a fence to abate the nuisance. And so they're not trespassing because there's no intent on their part. So it's considered to be nuisance. The dilemma becomes, is what do I do with those branches? If I put them through the chipper and I keep them as chip, well, I've actually gone through a process of conversion or a theft, essentially, of the items. They're not mine. And this is a really sort of weird bit of common law that says, if your pear tree or your apple tree or your avocado tree overhangs the boundary, all the fruit on that tree still belong to the owner of the tree, even though it's been grown over your space. So there's all these little nuances with it. There are some laws that address it, and that's important. So, and there are some applications of law that apply to it. So, for example, the tree roots do overgrow the property, but cutting those tree roots back will destroy or damage my tree. Then we really have the Crimes Act in each jurisdiction will come into play in that situation. So what
if the work that you do destroys the tree.
That's right. It destroys or significantly harms. That's right. But if the work doesn't, and that's usually what the case is, then the person has the right to abate the nuisance as they see fit. So you've got this this process where there aren't clear boundaries. Now, the laws do give some when you get things like development control plans, where, for example, a council has to be asked for permission before you do something, or where there's a requirement to meet some vegetation control legislation.
So if the tree in question is protected by a development control plan, and the council wants permission, wants to have an application to do the work, they normally require that to be signed. So who signs it? Can you sign it, or does the tree owner have to sign it?
It's on what the development control plan says. So again, I mean, there's three certainties in law. The first certainty is that the law's an ass. The second certainty is that the only certainty is the legal team will win. So you want to be on the legal team. You don't want to be fighting on either side. So you want to be an expert or a lawyer or a barrister. And the third one is, to almost every piece of legislation, there's a loophole. So that sort of comment infers that legislation is often badly written. And it's badly written because English is complex and the people that are writing it often don't think about it. If you want a perfect piece of legislation and you're in New South Wales, we have our set for complying development. And if you look at the number of amendments to that set, you realize how badly written it has been. And it still doesn't do a particularly great job. So there's lots of uncertainty in legislation, but in most instances, the tree owner would need to be the applicant, yes. And that creates a whole pile of issues, of course, that the tree owner doesn't want to. And in New South Wales, we have one of the most delightful pieces of legislation. That's the Trees Disputes Between Neighbours Act. And that simplifies it down. It simply says if I wanted to abate that nuisance and I'm restricted for some reason because of another piece of legislation, then I can apply to the court for orders, and the court is at liberty to grant those orders. Having said that, it is a land and environment court, and the word environment needs to be taken into consideration. They're not going to allow frivolous orders to go through. They've got to be reasonable grounds for them to order something. And the tree must, to do that, either be obstructing a significant view and being a part of a hedge, or it must be posing an imminent risk or a significantly elevated risk of harm to a person or property, or it must have already caused damage. So you still get to the spot where all I'm wanting to do is lift it up another half meter because I'm a 6'6" person, and I keep on having to duck when the rain comes and the foliage gets heavy. There's really a limited application. So if you had a neighbour that was in dispute in that situation, you're screwed. That's the bottom line. And look, that's unfortunate.
That kind of follows the general thrust of the DCP protection of trees, so that councils normally won't let you do tree work that's frivolous or has dubious benefits. Well, they normally want some reason for doing the work. So
some will allow sort of, a 10% annual pruning, which I think is, again, one of those bits of legislation that's badly written, or one of my favorite ones, Kringai Council, which will allow you to prune branches overhanging the roof because they're overhanging the roof. That's probably a little excessive in my view of the world. But again, that will vary. It's the same trees within 3 meters of a building. I mean, what's a tree within 3 meters of a building got to do with anything to do with a tree?
That's pretty common, that exemption.
It is. And this goes back to often preconceptions and misconceptions about trees modelling and guiding legislation. So, for example, when the tree disputes between neighbours legislation was first put out as a draft, one of the comments I wrote back to the Attorney General's office and said is, look, the number of people that die from trees is small. The initial data we had then was about 1 in 8 million. So, we're in the early stages of the work. And I said, it'd be hard to justify arguing that a tree posed a danger to a person unless it was completely knackered. And, I copped a fair bit of resistance from the Attorney General's department. And in fact, in some of the earlier land and environment court cases, I copped a lot of resistance on that basis. And it's been a hard process to change the thinking, even amongst arborists. I mean, there are arborists out there, Peter, that will hold the view and do hold the view. And it'd be interesting to see that, for example, I think I mentioned this the other day, the Roman Catholic Church Diocese in Sydney has pretty well eliminated every lemon scent gum and every spotted gum on every school grounds because they're dangerous. And yet the data that we looked at when we looked at Crimbia failures, including during storms and microbursts, we found that the level of risk posed by them was within the broadly acceptable range in most instances, or tolerable and LARP. So where does that view come from, and why is it there? And I think a part of that has come from arborists over the last 30 years. When I first started, we filled trees with cavities, with massive cavities. Then we started cutting them down, and then we started valuing them. And we removed every tree with the fly fruiting body. We removed every tree that, had a co-dominant stem. At one stage, I remember bracing trees simply because they had tightly included junctions, on species that wouldn't even give a damn about nowadays.
Didn't that also come from the early risk assessment processes out of the United States, where they said, well, we have these tree incidences, so what can we do about that? And they noticed that trees that had faults were often the ones that failed. So they said, well, if the tree's got a fault, then that's a problem. And so we've got to do something. That means we've got to do something about it. They didn't really pay much attention to the target of the tree. And that really...
Yeah, target's one thing that's missing there. But the other thing is in the comment, and you expressed it beautifully, they saw bits that failed and they said, therefore, these issues or these factors in the tree are a concern. What they never did, and we still haven't largely done, in a couple of small studies, is looked at what didn't fail. And yes, everything will always fail at the weakest spot, but the weakest doesn't mean inadequate. So for example, if I have a ding in my car at 40 kilometers an hour, my crumple zone is going to collapse. It's intended to collapse. That doesn't make it dangerous. That just means that's the weakest spot. And so during a storm, trees are going to fail at the weakest spot. That's just it. If we can see those, we can say, oh, yes, I could have told you that was the weakest spot beforehand. But at the same time, in the same storm, an adjacent tree fails and there's nothing that you can observe. And you look at the two bits of the ground, both 150 millimeters in diameter, you say, one had an included junction. That was dangerous. The bit that failed that had nothing observable that led to the failure, we say that was freaky. Well, that's inconsistent. It's got a logical error in it. No, what it says is that the weakest spot in the tree that had the inclusion was the inclusion, and the weakest spot of a tree that didn't have the inclusion was elsewhere. And we couldn't determine it. Now, removing the included junction does nothing, because we don't know that that reduces the risk overall at all. So we might as well just leave it. Now, I'm not talking about something that's actively cracking, but I'm talking about something that's, got a reasonable amount of adaptive growth going on with it. Does that make sense? We've really got to stop using the word defect to infer inadequacy, because clearly everything that didn't fail was adequate.
I think that there's a move to stop using the word fault or defect altogether. I prefer to talk about them as features. I think is a much better way of looking at it.
Yeah, and they're the risk features or risk factors that may or may not, some of them will increase the risk, but some of them may reduce the risk. And it's interesting, I was looking at the, I can pull them up for you. Let me do that now.
And Mark, even if the risks increased, the question should be, well, how much has the likelihood of failure increased? If it's only increased slightly, then it still doesn't mean that the tree is likely to fail.
Well, that's right. And it doesn't mean that the risk is anywhere near being unacceptable or intolerable. But I thought these were interesting. This is the Cornell tornado. And these were trees that went through that tornado and survived. Have I shared my screen with you? I haven't, have I?
No.
I need to do that. So hang on. Share screen. And you should be able to see a tree now.
Yeah.
All these lower branches were knocked off. Co-dominant stems, they're doing okay in a tornado, okay. The top has gone from this Arboricula. All these branches here have gone. Of course, you can guess the fate of each one of these trees. Anyone want to guess for me?
Well, I would hope that they were just left alone and they would regrow their branches.
I would say more than half of them have been cut down, because what would happen next time if there was another tornado? And that's the logic error that we get when it comes to risk. I was listening to a wonderful lecture by a German mathematician and heuristics expert on risk the other day. And I had to, again, it was miles and it was the US, so I had to work it to Australia. But if I were to fly directly Sydney to Brisbane or Sydney to Melbourne, how many miles or how many kilometers do you think I'd have to drive to pose that same sort of risk?
Probably around the world several times.
Around the world several times. Rob, do you want to have a guess?
Oh, no. Is that going the right way?
And this is why risk is so difficult for us. The answer, you'll be surprised to know, is for me, I pose a greater risk driving to the airport at 65 kilometres away. At 40 kilometres, I've had the same risk as a non-stop flight from Sydney to Melbourne, or a non-stop flight from Sydney to Brisbane. The same risk of mortality. And I know this because, of course, Peter, you know, I like to drive those trips and still do. And I know that I'm significantly increasing my risk in doing those trips. I'm taking on the equivalent of flying 25 times every time I drive to Brisbane. And the same logic fallacies occur here when people see these things. They say, oh, it's dangerous, parts failed, we've got to get rid of it, rather than saying, look, small branches broke off, what a wonderful thing, the whole tree didn't fail. And my classic example, whilst this is Arboricure, my classic example of a tree that does that is Crimbia citriodora. It sheds branches, it seldom has whole tree failure. How should we rate Crimbia citriodora? Well, according to the Sydney Diocese schools, we should get rid of them because they're dangerous. I'd far rather have a Crimbia citriodora than a Eucalyptus nicolai in a school ground, or a Eucalyptus microcories. So it's the fallacy that comes from it. You can see what ends up happening. The tops are broken out, not the codominant stems. So, what does that tell me? Well, it tells me that the weakest part in this time when we applied pressure to failure wasn't the codominant stems. And I've got probably 30 or 40 examples of this from eucalypts and agathis, and so a broad range of trees where a really bad quality codominant stem, and Arboricure is not bad. In eucalypts, it can be quite bad, where the trees failed above the codominant stem, where it's been included. We don't look up at that. We usually just look down at the ground and put it through the chipper, and that's it. It's gone and it's done. So again, failed above the codominant junction. The codominant junction here was only small and minor, but again, it didn't fail. It failed above that spot. All the lower branches off. So consistent pattern there. You don't need to see that one.
Although, Mark, we don't know whether there was included bark in those junctions. They might have been nice, smooth, rounded junctions, mightn't they?
No, those were Arboricurias. They're all tight, but Arboricure almost never fails at a codominant stem. And a part of the reason why, and it's a bit of trickery there, Rob, and I apologise for the sleight of hand, is that they produce compression wood. So there was going to be pressure pushing them apart, or pressure for them to fail, and they wanted to produce adaptive tissue. They'd produce it on the outside. When you're talking about a angiosperm, there's nothing that you can put the hook onto. There's nothing you can attach it. The only thing you can put down is prop tissue. Having said that, they do put down prop tissue, and they put down lots of it. So prop tissue is, let me see if I can pull up a picture of prop tissue. I'm pretty sure I can. Prop tissue is formed on the underside of a branch at the junction. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. The anatomical center of this branch is probably about here. All of this is not compression wood, and it's not tension wood. It's ordinary wood put down rapidly on the underside to add strength. Interesting, there's a wound and a crack on the top side. And that's not uncommon, again, because this area at the top junction is difficult for angiosperms to deal with anatomically. The tissue, the vascular tissue has to come up and turn at that spot, and that's horrible, which is why we get Phoracantha or longicorn damage in those junctions, and why we get bird damage in those junctions is part related to the longicorn, is part related to the fact that it's vulnerable. You could have a big cavity in here, you could lose all of that right in there, and that would still have more than adequate strength. And so this is this issue again, is I've got a cavity, but I've got more strength. And I know I've shown you the Philinus paradox.
Yeah.
You know, where the end result is you end up with greater strength. And you know, whilst I show you one nice specimen, I wonder how many of you actually go out when they cut down trees. And some of these were from cut down trees. Someone was asking me about this the other day. You know, here's the tree that was cut down that I just photographed. Look at all this wood going all the way out there, all this wood going out there. If I just took that bit of wood there, I've got more wood than I've lost, and it's further out. So I've got, again, a stronger stem. So why did it get cut down? The answer is because it had phylinus. What's really, really odd is that if the cockatoos had come in and started to chew that out and make a cavity, we might have kept it, because we would have said, oh, well, it's got, you know, ecological benefit now. We should really think about keeping that. And you know, it's difficult in dealing with that. So it'll take some time for us to change as a society. But I think a lot of it is that, exactly as you said, Peter, is that process of society seeing things, making things weak or inadequate, rather than asking the question, yes, it's got a codominant stem, it's adequate. One of the things when it comes to codominant stems, there's some research that shows that angles tighter than 25 degrees increases the decreases the strength. And that's based on taking a codominant stem and, hang on a second. Let me, how do I stop sharing? Stop share, yep, there. I'm taking a codominant stem and attaching just above the junction two load cells and pulling, or a load cell and a holding point, and pulling until it fails. And you can see that, you know, if you compare different sizes, how easily they break out. But trees don't fail that way. Trees never fail that way. Duncan Slater makes a really good comment about this. Trees fail when the load overall is placed on them, and you don't get codominant stems failing often because parts bend and parts yield, and as parts bend and yield, then they absorb energy, and it doesn't necessarily get transferred down to the failure point in the tree itself. So, yeah.
I would make the comment about the attitude to trees is that there seems to be an idea in the community that trees are inherently dangerous. And my view of why that is because they're big and they're there, you can see them. And when you're walking along, you can imagine if they fell, and you know that they do occasionally fall. So people look at them and they see an obvious risk, but they don't think further that just because the risk is obvious doesn't mean that it is automatically high.
That's right. And yet, you know, like I just gave the example, we don't think, oh, look, I'm going to go drive today. I'm going to go drive 40 kilometers. They don't say, oh, that's horrible. And they don't sit there in a sweat. But we have people with deep psychological fear of flying that arises from the fear of the risk level associated with it. We have exactly the same with people and swimming. You don't want to go to the ocean because there are sharks in it. You know, your odds of getting taken by a shark, particularly in metropolitan beaches, is obscenely small. But we have those concerns, and that's because we're not trained, Peter, as people to deal with risk. So yes, we get it all wrong. And I think that's in part what has motivated me to want to do the data research that we've done, look at a failure of Crimea, look at failure of included junctions. And, you know, this recent one that I'm in the middle of that I'll share with you very quickly now, I'm happy to, as I said, if you ask Peter, send you a draft, you can have a look and critique it.
Yes, please.
Yeah, so just anyone that asks you for it by email, Peter, please forward it. I just got to share again. Share screen. And so the whole thing comes from a paper by Kondo on looking at the health benefits of trees in Philadelphia. And he does a really interesting job, and he presents it in a manner that, as a risk person, I could understand. So he looks at it and says, this is increasing the canopy by 5%, will give life-saving benefits of, and he gives us some numbers. So a 5% increase in canopy would give 302 lives saved, while a 10% would save 376 people in a year. So the greater benefits comes early, and that's increasing those areas that are most denuded. And so he tells us how many square kilometres there are, and he tells us how they work that out. He tells us that 80 of the areas have already enough trees, so we can work that down to number of square metres, and so it's 278 million square metres would be 5% increase. So great. And that we can work out what a square metre increase, that's 5% of that total area is 13 million square metres. So 13 million square metres of canopy would save 302 lives. And that's a really interesting figure from our side. So we look at a thing called value of statistical life, and that's a tool that's used to put a value on a random life. It's not saying that the life is only worth that. It's not saying that people are only worth that, but how do we handle it? And there's some, sorry, there's a mistake there. There's some really important papers in that regard. One in particular for Australia that looks at it and says, look, realistically, maybe we should have a value of statistical life of $10 million, but if we did, society probably couldn't afford it, which is really a fascinating view. So he says that we probably lied on because we couldn't afford it. During the COVID lockdowns and management, we spent about 50 million per life saved, so about 10 times or 5 times the upper limit. And again, that made no sense. So we do have this value of statistical life in Australia. It's about $5.2 million for 2022. And if we looked at that, we'd say, well, that would be the equivalent of about 1.5 million Australian dollars for what they're doing in Philadelphia. And we say, okay, that works down to a dollar value of $112.94 per square metre, which is an interesting figure in my mind. But it's not a fair figure. Philadelphia has a higher population density, and so we look at that. We say, okay, Philadelphia has a population density of about 4,337 people versus Sydney, which is almost 10 times one-tenth exactly, and Melbourne, that's about a tenth exactly. So Philadelphia, very dense city. So the more people get the benefits of that urban canopy. So we need to take our answer and divide it by 10 is the bottom line to it. So we come down to a figure in the end of about $11.20 per metre squared is the value of canopy in anywhere where there's a density that we're talking about. So a major city, and where we can increase the canopy by 5% and not be at 30%. Because once we got at 30%, the data suggests the benefits start to wane. And it's interesting.
But that's the benefit of an additional tree. So what is interesting about this is looking at a tree that's existing and saying, well, that tree is worth so many dollars a year.
Yeah, so that's exactly what we do next is we say, okay, we take a tree with a 10-metre diameter canopy. And again, I don't know how many of you, when you're doing development site work, for example, notice that, you tend to have this sort of close relationship to spread and height. So a 10-metre diameter tree, you might expect to have a canopy be somewhere between 10 and 15 metres high. A 20-metre spread tree, you might expect to be between 20 and 25 or 30 metres high, somewhere in that range. So we looked at a couple of examples. So a tree with a 10-metre canopy spread provides life-saving benefits of about $880 a year to the community, while a 20-metre canopy spread tree provides $3,550 worth of canopy benefits, health benefits to the community year. And so we ask the next obvious question is, then can you look at this from a risk perspective? Because we, or I and two others did a paper a while back in the journal where we looked at the need to do a risk-benefit analysis. In other words, the risk alone is not sufficient to make decisions about it if you're getting some benefits. And so we looked at it and we said, okay, well, let's make some assumptions based on some reasonable data that's out there. And on that basis, the average tree provides about 50 cents worth of harm, and yet gives us $880 worth of benefits, provided the tree's healthy. The greatest risk would be getting rid of trees. And so then we modeled that with a couple more, 20-meter spread tree. And we said, well, okay, the risk of harm is about $10,000. If it was 1 in 10,000, sorry, would be about $100 per annum. And that 1 in 10,000 trees is a pretty stuffed tree. It's a tree that's verging on the unacceptable level. Interestingly, it's only twice the risk of driving in terms of mortality, or about the same risk of driving if you look at harm overall. So I'm not sure how we adjust society-wise as that. But what's really interesting is it provides $35,500 worth of health benefits over the same 10-year period that you'd spend $1,000 doing the work. So if the process was removing the tree, the greatest harm would not be by leaving it, but by removing it. So the real risk is removing the tree, not retaining it. Now, there's some provisos in that, and that is if it's a tree in someone's backyard, then they're always exposed to that risk. And it's one individual that's living with that risk. But society is still getting the benefit of it as a whole. It's a little one of those strange anomalies, isn't it? And we say, well, that's a little bit like the principle of vaccines. You know, we make a vaccine available and some people are going to get killed by it or be harmed by it. The bulk of society isn't going to be affected by it at all. It's not quite the same because a person gets to decide whether they want to have a vaccine or not. Whereas the tree forced upon a person in their backyard or their front yard, whether they're the ones wearing the risk, is not quite the same, but it's somewhat similar. So yes, it's certainly a different perspective. It means that healthy trees that are structurally optimized are probably already posing a level of risk that's already as low as reasonably practicable. That is, unless you can do something that's minor, like remove a dead branch or remove a fault that you can do with pruning, removal of the tree is not the option. And so if you look at our lemon-scented gums, for example, in Catholic schools, and let's just say that on an average, 500 of them have been removed in the Sydney diocese. Well, that's a fair bit of damage, about $1.5 million worth of damage per annum as a result of that risk aversion. That's a pretty serious consequence. Any thoughts or comments?
Well, despite all the above, I still wouldn't recommend planting a lemon-scented gum in a school ground. I would find a better species, I think.
I think I'd agree with you, Rob, much to my horror. Not because there's anything wrong with it, but because inevitably some, and I've got to be very careful here, I'll upset somebody if I do, I apologize, but some arbophobic psychopath will come along and say, let's get rid of them all. And that's exactly what's happened in Sydney. One individual has condemned essentially every lemon-scented gum and every spotted gum. I think there are better trees for many areas in schools that have great longevity. And, you know, I have a passion for live oak, Quercus virginiana, cork oak, Quercus suber.
Camphor laurel's pretty good too, Mark.
Yeah, camphor laurel is phenomenal, Peter, with the exception of its propensity to produce seed. If I could breed a sterile triploid, I'd be at it tomorrow. But I'm quite happy with a fig tree and a Moreton Bay or a Port Jackson fig in a school ground. I think, you know, big, broad trees are wonderful trees to put into schools.
Great shade trees and great trees for kids to climb too.
Yeah, but again, you know, Robin, to give you an idea of the tree phobia that is out there, in 2014, late 2014, I had a school call me. They wanted me to review a risk assessment. Their risk assessor had come out, and the Ficus microcarpa hillii had some low branches, and he said kids could run into this branch and die, therefore they need to be removed. Therefore the tree needs to be removed. Again, not sure that those two are synonymous, but I'm wondering how many children have actually died running into things. And just last month, my local council, and I won't mention my local council's name to protect them, but they issued an order to one of the local schools saying, please prune back the branches from over the footpath, because they're making the pedestrians walk around those branches and walk off the concrete footpath. And that was a hazard, that was a risk. And I'm thinking, I wonder how many people have died walking around branches or walking into branches on a footpath. I'm reckoning the number is really, really small. Now, I'm not saying that it hasn't happened. You know, I've come across now record for 2 people that have been killed by magpies, both of them making the person swerve into an oncoming car. But still, there, you know, arguably that there are places where we do need to think differently, but in most cases, you know, branches over a footpath are just an annoyance and not something that would make me paranoid. But please take my comments there as somebody who's really comfortable with risk. You know, I'm not worried about dying. I'm not worried about sharks taking me when I go down to the water. I'm not worried about being killed by snakes and spiders. And I'm certainly not worried about being killed by a tree. And no, I'm not paranoid about being killed by beds. I do know that they're more dangerous than trees. And I think I might have mentioned previously, I just would love that comedy skit done by somebody that says, you know, we're outside Mr. and Mrs. Hartley's place, and Mrs. Hartley last night fell out of the bed again. This was a near miss. She could have died. This is quite catastrophic. You know, I wonder when Mr. Hartley's going to put soft fall on the bedroom floor so that, you know, Mrs. Hartley's protected. We'd never get the journalist out there. They'd just laugh at you. And yet trees fall over, and that's exactly what we get. Even though 11 times more people are killed by beds in Australia each year, we still have this, you know, there's been a storm, trees have fallen over, you know, type journalism. It's just shoddy, shonky, poor quality journalism. And, you know, in part, arborists are part of the cause. Duncan Slater on his one of his posts recently put a link to a guy in Oregon in the US explaining why a tree failed. And you can see the included junction. You can see where the tissue's been long dead. And the guy says, well, it was the hot weather, the tree exploded. And again, that wouldn't have been a problem if it wasn't a consulting arborist that said it. And I just sit there and shake my head and think, you know, we're another generation of arborists at least before we get past the myth stage, maybe 2 generations, you know. It certainly won't happen in Peter in my lifetime. Mark, it might happen in yours. You're a little on the younger side, but I wouldn't hold my breath on it. I would say maybe my great-grandchildren may get to a stage where we see and value trees differently. And that's the purpose of this. So, Peter, I will tidy it up. I will add more references in. I will take constructive feedback on it. And then I'd like, if it's okay, to put it up with that other risk stuff on the website so that we can have people realize that, you know, if a tree is healthy, it's a pretty hard argument to say that the tree poses a risk that necessitates the removal of the tree. I don't have issues, as I said, with, you know, remedial tree work. It's just the removal I'm having issues with. You know. Okay. So, file, save. Next question is, how do we deal with auditing and audit reports? And I guess the first question I need to ask you all is, how should you audit something when you've got to audit it? Any thoughts? Let me ask you a quick one. You've got a site you've been asked to assess, to audit. It's a development site. The work's going ahead. You've written some specifications, or somebody else has written some specifications. First question I'm going to ask you is, when should you inspect it? Mark, come on, give me an answer.
Well, it depends on what the it can depend on what was written in the initial report, because often there's a timeline specified in there.
Good. So we've said, it said once a month, okay, and the city has said yes, once a month you to go out and inspect this site. So what? I give them a call and I say, hey, I'm going to be out there next Thursday. How does that work?
Well, that would give them time to tidy up any of the things they've been doing that they shouldn't have been doing.
Which is good, and it's bad, isn't it?
Mm.
So I don't know. It's an interesting one. Again, I don't have a perfect answer, but I like to inspect things when I choose. So here's one. This is one where there's meant to be 20 centimeters of mulch and no more. And I went past on a public holiday, thank goodness the Queen died, and saw this. And I said, look, I don't have a big issue with it. I understand what's happened. You've removed all the trees on the site and you've chipped it into that spot. And, you know, I get why that's happened. But can we store it on the other side of the fence? If you get it back down, be careful when you're moving that stuff out. They've got an excavator on the site, you know. You're going to have to get somebody in there to do the last of it. Do not hit anything. Do not get the ground level. Just scrape it back. Is it the end of the world for the tree? What do you think?
It would take a while to really damage the trees, because that what's wrong with a big pile of mulch like that takes a while to have an effect. Yeah,
it does, a fair bit of time, but it's not desirable. So again, one of the nice things about seeing that is you get to see things that you wouldn't have otherwise seen. And a number of years ago, I moved a tree, and it was for the Public Works, and Public Works said, look, Mark, after about 4 years, the tree's not looking good, and we're not happy about that. And I said, well, how about me not being happy with you trenching right through past the trunk 2 years after it was moved? No, we didn't do that. And I said, well, here's the photographs. So, you know, if at least if something goes wrong now, I've got some understanding of why. And I agree with you, Peter. I'm not likely to have something go wrong, but if it does go wrong, or if I get in there and I find, you know, a branch broken off, now I know why. The excavator's been in there removing mulch. So I think there's some advantages to random inspections. That is, the time and the date within the month that I'll arrive is random. And that's my preference. There is the counter side is saying, look, get it sorted out before I get there so that every month I give you a nice clean bill of health. But I'd rather call the project manager up, which I did on the Friday, and say, hey, sort it out and send me a photograph so I can include it in my report, because I can't include this one. And he said, oh, yeah, okay. I'm not sure which one's right or which one's wrong. But I think from my side, it lets them know that I'm intending to keep them on their toes. There's another advantage, another fantastic advantage to random inspections. Can anyone suggest what it might be?
Besides catching them in the act?
Apart from catching them in the act, yeah. You don't want to catch them in the act, but I'd rather know that they've done something wrong than have to try and forensically determine it, you know, 2 months later or 5 or 6 months later. The other advantage is it makes really great use out of your time, because your scheduling can simply schedule it when you're doing something else nearby. So that's exactly what I had here. I had a little bit of extra time coming back from doing something, and I said to my granddaughter who was with me, let's just duck past and have a look at the site. I'll do a quick inspection, and that does work out well. So I always let my clients know that they'll be random, and I prefer to have my own lock to the site to allow access out of hours. It also means I can work longer hours, and also means I can see things that at a time that's convenient to me. So that's my preference for random. Should you inspect everything every time? What do you think?
I would.
Yeah, I think it's reasonable, depending on what you're inspecting. On a development site, it's reasonable because you're talking about a limited number. If you were doing the inspection of 1,000 trees in a planting program, you might start to looking at doing random inspections rather than complete inspections. In other words, you might do sectors or random trees in the street, and you'll get a pretty quick idea of other things at the same time. So I guess it depends on the scope and the size of what you're looking at. So let me look at a report if I can. I know I can. So I've just got to find the right page. And here. How would you deal with it? If you've got to inspect every item, how would you address that in terms of reporting?
So, Mark, I'm part of a relatively new consulting firm down in Tasmania. We don't get a lot of follow-up work from if we do a preliminary or an impact assessment. We don't seem to get, people don't seem to want a project arborist. What we seem to get a few jobs for is they call it oversight arborist here. So we'll go and watch them do trenching for local governments. So we've got a checklist. We go there and we just take lots of records and photos of compliance. And then present it to them in a checklist, 2-3 page report.
You got it. A checklist or a table. We use tables, which essentially is what a checklist is. You want to just make the process simple. Now, Mark, you haven't been to some of our other war meetings. I know that, because if you had been or listened to some of the earliest ones, I know that we all bitch about the same thing. That is, I say, look, the site should be inspected however frequently it is, and list the key inspection points. And I would be lucky to do 5%. And I think that tended to be the norm amongst most arborists. It's just a hard thing to get somebody to commit to the trees as being significant. And a part of that goes back to that issue again, is it's just a tree. There's this low value associated with trees.
A lot of builders and engineers treat trees as a nuisance. They don't see any value.
There's also a lot of discrepancies with different LGAs, local government areas in Tasmania. Everyone has their own sort of ideas of what's a high biodiversity value tree. So some councils really just want to see the report that we say that it's going to be able to be retained and put up a tree protection zone, and then you rarely hear back from them.
Yeah, look, I think that's the norm. I thought I had it out, and I don't have it out. I know what I said. I just searched for kissing. Yeah, well, we have huge variations, and then how they handle that can be immensely different. So each party will handle. So, for example, if you don't appropriately protect a tree in Sydney, you might find the council knocking on your door, Sydney City. If the tree goes missing on your site in Blacktown, the chances are they'll say, "Oh, don't worry about it. Cut down the right one, and put something big back in, like, I don't know, Buxus sempervirens." And so there are these discrepancies between local government everywhere, and that's driven by the fact that, again, society views trees differently in different areas. Although I wonder, and I'll get into trouble for this probably, but that won't be the first time, Peter. I wonder, when you get to something like a nice Labor government area like my local council, Blacktown City Council, which is the second largest council in the Southern Hemisphere, why they're not pinning and prosecuting more people for breaches of these things. And it makes you wonder whether they're taking backhanders from people, or whether the elected representatives are being told, look, back off, you know, we're pro-development and you've got problems. I have no idea what it is, but it does get to the stage where you start to get suspicious. Having said that, Mark, I was involved in the Lehman Street debacle, and you can get online and read all the stupidity involved in that. And the one thing I did learn out of Lehman Street was never ascribe anything to criminal or malicious intent that you can adequately account for with stupidity. So it may just be that there's a whole pile of stupidity in local government. I would hope not, but that's a possibility too.
Having worked for some local governments before, I can tell you there is some stupidity inside.
And I think there is some corruption. I think the two go hand in hand.
Yeah.
So yes, I would just do up a checklist of all the things. I was just trying to find one. I don't know why it hasn't been filed, but it hasn't as yet. So I'll just check to see if it's, no, it's not there. It was just simply the conditions of consent. Each condition of consent got put down in one side of the table, and a checklist with the opportunity to put a ticker across in the remainder. And then here's the next question. Do you sometimes get conditions of consent or conditions that you have to do that you look at and say, why am I doing this?
Oh, yes.
You get them, Peter. So we get them up in Sydney. Mark, I don't know whether you get them. Rob, do you get them down your end of the world?
I've got one this week to do. I have to supervise a concrete pour. now that's been specified by a city council here in Melbourne. What the hell I'm supposed to do, I've got no idea.
I will be honest about it, and I'm happy to be honest and on record. When I have to do, for example, excavation, supervision of excavation, I'll often go meet with the contractors involved, see if they understand what is important and how it's to be done. And if I'm comfortable enough that they know what to do and I watch them for a little while, I'll tell them, I'll be back. What time do you think you'll be finished? You know, do X, Y, Z, A, B, C. And I often feel that having me sitting there or standing there to do nothing, for example, if they're excavating, I know the roots, they've broken the root when they've broken the root. That's it. You know, I can expect that once they've finished cutting the 15 meters of trench just as adequately as I can standing around. So my answer would be, okay, well, I've given you instructions on what to do and, you know, what I'd like you not to do, and then I'll see you at the end of it all. And of more recent times, when it comes to root examination or root exploration, I hate doing it with a vengeance. It's just horrible work. I tell my clients that builders' labourers are a lot cheaper than consulting arborists. Dig it by hand, don't break any root greater than 1 centimetre in diameter. Call me when the trench is dug, and I'll come on out and have a look. And generally, I find that a builder's labourer can do a job about as good as I can. You know, if he knows what to do and how to do it. So, but yes, I do see things that are a little bit dumber than even supervising the pouring of concrete. I mean, Rob, supervise it for what? What are the criterion?
Well, exactly. It's a driveway, and I think it's a replacement of an existing driveway. And the council says, well, go and supervise it. But the other question is, you have to make a bit of money on these jobs. So if you can stay there for 2 or 3 hours, it's worthwhile driving out to the site. But if you're only going to be there for 10 minutes, how do you charge a fee for that?
Well,
Charging for the travelling time as well.
That's I guess a question of business practices. You know, my problem's not that I'm struggling for work. So yes, who have we still got online? Now we've still got Rob there. So I was answering your question, Rob. My question is never how how much work have I got to do, and worrying about work, my problems about the number of hours. And there's some secrets to that. And my secrets are threefold. I've been happy to share these all my life. First of all, I think arborists generally want to undercharge for their services. So I like to charge for a professional service equivalent to any other professional, like an engineer or an architect or whatever. And so my hourly rates are healthy. Then the other thing is I don't know whether you've ever had it happen to you, Mark, or Rob, whether you've had it happen to you. Now, Peter and I have discussed this. There are people out there that want it done quicker than you really want to get it done, and they're on the phone the day after you've been out on site just wondering how you're going with getting that report done. That you said you'd have to them in a week or 2 weeks or 4 weeks time. And I learned about 15 years ago that you needed to have a scale of fees that reflected the time that the work was done in. So we charge substantially more if somebody wants the work done urgently.
We've actually adopted that. The director of the company's, since hearing about it on the war sessions, he's adopted the tiered pricing session to these big projects, and it
makes all the difference.
Yeah. Well, it's just because everyone wants it done yesterday. When you say it's going to be a 2 or 3 week wait, people aren't interested. But there's only a few people in Tassie that do it, so it always ends up coming back anyway.
And then what they do is they hassle you and hound you and put your regular clients back and back. So we tell our regular clients we've got 4 to 6 weeks delay. Now I've got currently 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 of my own reports to do. So I'm sort of for the next 4 weeks. My next one due out, and the girls manage me with a nice big spreadsheet that tells me what I've got to do. The next one due out is on the 5th of the 10th. So I'm running ahead, but I'm in New Zealand teaching Qterra for most of next week. So I know it won't take a lot to be pushing back again. And so what that does is it means that I'm not worried about the fiscal component of consulting. I'm more worried about doing the task of consulting. And that does take a lot of pressure off me. Yeah, and Mark, everyone that says they've gone to a tiered structure for their consulting has said the same thing. Apart from anything else, the person that phones you up the day after and says, look, will you have it done by the end of the week? And you say to them, I sent you the fee structure, do you want us to put that up to critical? The number of times that they say yes or say no and then don't hassle you until it's 4 weeks. And we're horrible. We charge for time they spend contacting us, and we charge that in 5-minute blocks. So they send me an email saying, how is it going? That just costs them 1/12 of an hour billable.
That I don't think that's silly. I think that's honestly something we should look at, because the amount of back and forth I'll have with a residential client that's getting a relatively cheap report that thinks it's a cut and paste sort of job, and I'll talk to them more than I'll talk to big developers. It's ridiculous.
Look, and again, I love my domestic clients dearly. I mean, they're my favorite just because they're often tree lovers. So I'm happy to sort of, not make the same sort of make that I do on a commercial job. But first of all, I never speak to clients. It's almost a rarity. There's somebody in between that's dealing with that. I never answer the phone, because if I do, I just solve the problem on the phone and tell them to get stuffed, and I don't want to talk to them again. My classic is the lady that called on a Saturday saying that lives in Concord and she's worried about a tree, it's over her mother's house, and she's worried because it's dropped branches previously. And I said, look, I understand. How many times has a lemon-scented gum dropped branches? He said, the site? I said, no, but you gave me everything I needed to come to a reasonable conclusion as to what you're looking at. Same, I won't answer emails, because if I do, I'll do horrible things right back with, yes, well, there's lots of variables that could be causing this problem. And, do you want us to solve it for you or whatever? And then at the bottom in white text, I'll write, you have possums, it's glaringly obvious. And then wait for them to come back to me and say, yes, I'm wanting to go further. You say, well, if you look at the bottom of the text in white, you turn it black, you'll find out what your problem is. So I got told I can't do with emails either.
Well, can I just go a bit further?
Yep. Please.
My time is fully occupied. I don't have any advertising. I haven't advertised for years, and most of my clients are established clients that I've worked for a long time. My hourly rate is $130 plus GST, and I've hesitated to increase it because, as I said, they're all established clients. They know what I've charged for a long time.
So again, my only advertising is the website, which hasn't been adjusted for 10 or 15 years, and the old Tree Doctor website, which hasn't been adjusted since the late 1900s. My basic rate is $275 an hour, so almost double. And my critical work, and to give you a critical, I went out to a client's place the other, two development sites the other day. For the one client, both got a call out fee, and the call out fee is $1,540. And then it's $572 an hour. And I know it's hard to believe, but people are willing to pay that. Now, that's Sydney market, I get that. Tasmania is not going to be as affluent. Rob, you're based out of Melbourne or Adelaide?
Melbourne, yeah.
Melbourne's not too dissimilar fiscally. If you're in Canberra, it's better a hill than Sydney.
But Mark, some of the projects that I'm arborist for, the tree issues are critical. So if you can't solve those tree issues, then the project becomes basically unviable. And it might be a project that's going to be worth $20 million. So a few $1,000s to solve that critical issue is quite reasonable.
It's more than reasonable. And I know that I'm not at the peak of the charge out. I'm probably in the hourly rate. I am.
The other thing that I can comment to you, Rob, is that a few years ago, I would be involved in a project, and so a subdivision, for example, and they were working around trees, and I wanted to encourage them to get me out there and look at these issues, these tree issues, before they did the damage. And so I was careful not to charge very much for those visits. So I didn't charge for my traveling time and things like that. And the town planner who was involved in the project rang me up, and he said, I want you to stop this fee regime that you've got. He said, you're not charging enough. And basically, he said, you're making us look bad. These are the rates that you should be charging, professional rates. That clients can afford it, get with the program. And so I started doing that, started charging for my traveling time. They don't care.
Yeah, look, it's a difficult one, and to know where that sweet spot is. But I do think that if I talked in general, most arborists don't value their time as much as it is worth. That is, your time's worth more. And it's just the nature of who we are as people. We like the environment, we like our trees. And I'm talking about the arborist that loves trees, Rob. I'm not talking about the guy that works for the Catholic schools in Sydney who hates them. He's got a very different view of the world. But yeah, it's hard for tree lovers not to want to do things, but it needs to be balanced up. And as my business manager tells me all the time, my job is to make the company money, not to give it away. And I'm guilty of the latter more often than not, which is why, we take things like sitting down and looking at our rates and what we charge fairly seriously. But, if someone wants something done in a week and I'm going to lose out on a Saturday or Sunday or both, and that's often where that time comes from, the company wants to make a lot more money out of me. And I get rewarded nicely. I mean, I live a good lifestyle. I don't live an opulent lifestyle. I think Peter will attest to that. I live in a modest home and do modest things, but I'm not wanting for anything. And I think most arborists in that same position. So it's just getting us past that. And I remember many years ago when I was back on the tools, a gynecologist had set up a private hospital, gynecologists and obstetricians together, and I got to do some tree work at the private hospital. And he whinged and complained at the end of it all. And he said, "That's a lot of money you charge." And I said to him, "Well, I understand that, but you know, you charge similarly." He said, "Oh no, we don't, you know, we don't earn that sort of money." I said, "Well, when you include your profit on your nurses and your profits on your facilities and everything else, you do." And then he responded back with saying, "Yes, well, that's true, but people's lives are in my hands." This is, as I said, I was back on the tools, and I said, "Well, what a gutless individual you are, because I put my own life in my own hands." And that's all I had to say. And then he sent the check immediately with a apology and a bonus. As oftentimes, as Peter says, we undersell what we're worth. You know, not too many of the developments I deal with nowadays are under $1 million. And I mean, I'm having clients build houses that are $5, $6, $8, $10 million houses. And a tree is not a big issue. You know, to spend 10,000 on the tree and the tree issues is relatively small. Some of them will spend more than that just on buying their copper for their plumbing systems. You know, and yet the very first thing that you see when you arrive at somebody's property is their exterior, not their interior, not all those wonderful things they've done on the outside. And one scabby looking tree, one bad looking landscape makes a huge difference. Landscapers are equally as guilty of underselling the value of what they do. It's just notorious. And we're often the add-ons, not the primary components. So look, a couple of other things I want to talk about before we get off report writing, we largely have been off it, is when you are doing an audit report, you've got to weigh up how the criticism's done. And the one thing I said that I did wrong at Layman Street is it got into a critical process rather than an observational process. So if you're assessing pruning work, I know the pruning work's crap, you know the pruning work's crap, and that's the standard pruning work in general that I'll get to see. You know, I'm happy to make things a little bit more generalized. So most of the cuts appeared to be close to the final cut as illustrated in the standard, rather than saying, you know, boy, there are a lot of really average cuts. You know, the tree goes close to meeting the standard, you know, rather than it's a crap tree and probably shouldn't have been planted. And, you know, the excavation's gone closer than it should have to the tree, and I think I can show you that fairly quickly. Photographs, I'm not sharing, am I, Peter?
No, you're not.
Let me share a screen. I have a love-hate relationship with landscape architects, and I don't know what it is or why, but I do. And so I was asked out to have a look at some trees recently at a site where we'd been doing some bits, Bulk and Hills. It'll either be Balkan Hills or Castle Hill. Right, so it'll be Castle Hill. And the landscape architect was a little concerned about these trees here. I think you can see them on the screen. Yeah.
Yep.
The work was probably a little closer to them than you might like. 1 times trunk diameter. Little closer than we want. The first question the landscape architect asked was, I don't understand why you'll allow work as close as that, given the Australian standard says you're meant to be 12 times trunk diameter. And I said, well, I think that might be a little late. He said, but why are you going to allow this to occur? And I said, I don't think you've been to the site. This photograph is in my report. I don't think you've read the report. Now, there's a point to which you just, at some stage or other, you want to be blunt and to the point, but you've got to try and tone that down. So my answer is this work is probably closer than it should have been. This work was done 3 years ago. One tree died, the tree that's furthest from the excavation. That pipe was put in 3 years beforehand. Okay, they've re-exposed it. The landscape architect says, well, how can you support a retaining wall 2 meters away from those trees? And my answer is really easy. It'll be nice to see some soil go back in and the desiccation along that excavated margin stopped. It really is easy to be careful, is to be derogatory in the way that we express our auditing. You know, rather than sort of say, look, this is not ideal. However, the trees are currently responding well, and there's no reason to believe that the trees are currently likely to die. If they fail, they're unlikely to cause any significant harm at this stage. What else can I say? The way I'd like to express it, Rob, for the clarity of it all, is this is living proof that people and gorillas can procreate and produce viable offspring that operate excavators. You've got to weigh that up. In other words, oftentimes you can get a better response longer term from the people doing the work by not being excessively negative. And I guess that's the one learning experience that I've had in 30 years of doing these reports and upsetting people, is that you need to try not to overstep the mark. Now, Peter will tell you, I'm really good at upsetting people. So I still do want to say, seriously, you know, have you got something wrong, or were you dropped on your head as a child? You know, but that is not the thing that you want to say to a client. Have I been guilty of doing that? No, Jessica does that. Now, look, yeah, so I would express this by saying the work has come substantially closer to the trees than was specified, and then would normally be considered desirable. However, at this stage, the trees appear to be relatively unaffected by the work. That's all that I would say. And then there was some remedial work, and the remedial work would be, it would be ideal that the area be backfilled and the retaining wall completed as soon as possible. Something like that. So it doesn't necessarily have to be all doom and gloom when you express it.
And were there any repercussions for the trees that died for the owner?
This is a weird one. The council and then the Land and Environment Court approved the development without an arboricultural impact assessment report. I did a preliminary, it's marked as a preliminary, and somehow or other it got approved without a full impact assessment report or any tree protection plan. And when the council, he did an amendment to the design, and the council said, well, you'll need to amend your arboricultural impact assessment report. And that's when they realized they didn't have one.
What report?
Wonderful. And this was one of those ones where, and again, this is this interesting bit about how people think about time. Between the time that they called the office and asked for a full report to be done, or an amended report, which meant a full report had to be done to address the amendments, and the time that we actually went ahead was probably 6 weeks. And these were one of the people that wanted it done within 1 week. Had they made the decision initially, we would have had it done. We just had another company call us this week. We've been looking at a project in a facility in Sydney, and I guess now that project's been on the run and they've been backwards and forward to us for probably 4 months. And they're upset that we won't do it cheaper than the critical rate if they want it done in a week. You know, my view is let them call Rob.
Thanks, mate.
And likewise, you'll get people that will call you and ask you to do things that you don't want to do, and you need to be very clear. Our service agreement covers all of that. But, you know, we had a client not so long ago say, look, we want you to write this. And we just simply said, we're not even interested in starting the project. What was interesting is that they'd already said, go ahead. They'd already booked it in. They cancelled the day beforehand when we wouldn't agree to write what they wanted. And then they realized there was a cancellation fee and they weren't happy about that either, but they ended up paying it. So yeah, again, what happens in that situation? You know, I've booked time. I've done my whole scheduling, or the girls have, the team have. I can't use the word girls anymore, politically incorrect. The people in my office, I don't know whether that's acceptable anymore. The organisms in my office have, have done all the scheduling, and now it has to be redone. And I'm probably going to be sitting around in a McDonald's store for half an hour having lunch for a change, rather than you know, grabbing a sandwich through a service station and keeping on driving whilst I'm having lunch. So yes, there's another thing for you to look at, is what happens when they cancel. And so the important thing out of an audit report is be respectful. Keep your audits as random as you can. I think you'll find that far more revealing. Use tables or a checklist type format, however you want to lay that out. Tables are a great way of doing that. Use tables, and I assume that everyone here knows how to use tables. Anyone not?
I think we've looked at the use of tables in some of our earlier sessions.
Yeah, look, it's just one of those tools that works well. Some people use Excel for the same purposes, and that's fine. It's just a relational database using a rather clever set of tables, but it's still a table. Okay, guys, well, I'm going to call it a night. It's 8 o'clock. And I will pull up a couple of example reports for the next time round that show you how some of those things are done and shouldn't be done. I'll pull you up one of the Layman Street reports, and you can have a quick look at how I say to you, the things you say and the way you say them can be really important. And in Layman Street, in the final stages, they actually had a commercial editor and journalist work on my documents because I had alienated people. And one of the things that I hadn't picked up is things like a statement such as obviously, or it's plain that, can be really quite offensive to people, because what you're actually saying is you weren't smart enough to see it. And so just choices of words can really be upsetting when it comes to this sort of order or review or stage that involves criticism, and you've got to be careful of that. Okay, guys, well, I'll see you in 3 weeks or 4 weeks or whatever it is, depending on whether you're warring or tipsing.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you very much, guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Mark. That's great.
Mark, thanks for sharing that you'd decided to use a scale of fees that varied depending on time frame. It's encouraging to hear people doing it.
Well, I think so. I think, you know, we can't undersell the industry. It's also, there's just, yeah, there seems to be quite a lot of work on it. Everyone wants it done now.
And it compensates for the extra time and effort. I mean, you know, you're back here now working at this hour.
I'm actually in Melbourne, hence the lovely decor in a hotel room. I'm doing my grad cert in Arboriculture.
Okay. Yeah, but again, it covers for those sort of things. When you can, on a job, pick up a premium, the premium allows either the company or yourself as an individual. Peter, you're doing a scale of fees that's time prompted at the moment, aren't you? Somewhat.
Informally, yes. So what I'll do is I'll put a fee proposal in and put an ordinary time frame on it, and then if they come back and say, can we have it any sooner, I say to them, well, I usually charge a premium for that, and they agree or not.
Yeah. And again, it's the cream on the cake. It's the little bit at the top that allows you to do the things that Rob's not getting to do, because Rob's not doing it. So Rob, have a look at it. If you want to email me about some bits in that, I'm happy to.
But the other thing that I do, Mark, is when I'm putting a fee proposal together, it's usually a fixed fee. So I don't discuss how many hours that I intend to work or that I'm promising to work. I just say this report's going to cost X amount of dollars inclusive of GST. And so when I'm putting that fee proposal together, I look at what work I think is involved, but also what sort of a project it is. So if it's mum and dad that are trying to renovate their swimming pool and there's a nice tree there that they want to keep, I will charge them X amount of dollars for that. But if it's a developer, and like I say, he's looking at having to solve these tree problems and he's got a $20 million project, then it'll be 2X.
Yeah. And I think I made a comment earlier and I didn't get to complete it, which was, my hourly fees may be towards the upper end of the industry in Sydney. My bill out on projects is actually lower down than my pricing structure, and that's due to efficiency. And the sort of thing that you're talking about, Peter, is it's not uncommon for somebody to look at a project like this and say, well, yes, I think there were about 43 trees on this site originally. Therefore, we're going to charge you $8,600 on that thing. Whereas I might go and do that and it might pop out in 3 or 4 hours, and they could be in and out of it for, well, it won't be 3 or 4 hours, 6 hours, might be out for $2,000 for a Arboriculture impact assessment report. And some of that's to do with how people feel about it. And my dilemma with the fixed sum is I've been done enough times where somebody says to me, there's only one tree. And my worst one ever was, there's only one tree on a development site in Parramatta. It just so happened to be the second oldest olive in Australia. They wanted a transplant feasibility done on that. It couldn't be done without moving it. It had to be moved within the city limits because of the size of the tree. So therefore I had to find suitable locations and routes for it. And what I estimated was going to take me 1 day ended up taking me almost 3 days. So I've always felt that it was easier just to simply say, I don't want to come up with a fixed price, but I do have clients that demand it. And when we give them a range, it'll take 6 to 8 hours to do that report. And they say, look, we need a fixed price. We'll say 8 hours then. And I'm amazed at the number of times they'll say yes to that, but they won't say yes to 6 to 8 hours. In other words, it won't cost you any more than 8, but it may be as little as 6. No, can't deal with that. Got to be a fixed sum.
The problem with giving a range of prices that I've found, and the reason that I don't do it, is that if you say 6 to 8 hours, then I'll be thinking, I like the 8 hours, and they'll be thinking, I like the 6 hours.
It's interesting, but I guess it depends on who you are. For me, it's about charging the deliverable time. So if it's taking me 6.5 hours to do, it's 6.5 hours. If it's taking me 8 hours, it's 8 hours. If it's taking me 10 hours, it's still 8 hours. But there's that other side to it too. And I've certainly had it happen where I've estimated that it's going to take them 6 hours, say, for example, to write the report. And you get there and it's a straightforward thing and you're going to be out in 2 hours. You've said 6 hours. So then you go and spend an extra 3 hours trying to do something different that you've never done before to add value to it. And I don't know whether any of you are guilty of that. But it's one of those things that it's hard. Whereas hourly, it's what I build, and that's the time. I've taken 4 hours, it's 4 hours, or I've taken 2 hours, it's 2 hours. But yes, one of the things that I was going to say, Peter, is I got a little bit of a shock. My average school tree risk assessment comes out somewhere between $800 and about $1,200. And they're fairly simple reports that just pick up the trees that are at the higher end of the spectrum. And colleague said to me, is that all? He said, typically I charge 6 to 8.
Oh.
Yeah. And I thought, boy, no wonder you're not doing too many of them. Now, my hourly rate is considered to be high amongst tree risk assessments, but the efficiency that I can do one in is because I'm not worried about all the little fluff of, there's a dead branch here and I don't want to talk about the dead branch here and the dead branch there. I just want to talk about the things that pose a risk that isn't tolerable. Sorry, it's tolerable. If it's an acceptable risk, just ignore it. So yes, I guess there are many ways that we as professions, I'll share one other one with you that was really interesting. There's a colleague many years ago who's no longer in the industry, but he had a really neat little system that I couldn't adhere to ethically. He would say, look, my rates are, and this goes back a fair way, Rob, so I don't think it's, he was 120 an hour almost 20 years ago. And he would say, I'll come out, I'll look at the trees, I'll do the preliminary. When I'm outside, I'll get all the data. When I've looked at it, I can give you a fixed price. And they would say yes. And he would jack the fixed price up on that absolutely astronomically. So he'd look at it and say, I'm going to take 6 hours to complete, so I'll bill you for 18.
Wow.
And their view of it was, well, crap, we've already got him in, he's done the preliminary, we've got to pay that. And so he would use that to make a disproportionate profit. Again, it's not illegal. It's just, it doesn't.
I'm not comfortable with the ethics there.
Yeah, I'm not comfortable with it either, because the inference is he's going to be doing a reasonable quote, not something that's, you know, he's hooked them in and now he's going to put them on an elevator and take them right up the top. So yes, look, we used to have a really interesting unit, and I don't know whether it's back in the curriculum or not, but called Implement Professional Practice. Do you remember that?
I do.
Yeah, it's a really good unit that addresses, you know, some of these issues. And you may recall we did the art gallery. Maybe we'll do that online at some stage. Look at, do you remember the two artists in the art show?
I don't think so.
Yeah, okay. Well, we might play with that. It looks at what are ethics and what is ethical, and it's a really difficult thing. There's these are grey lines. Society changes. You know, Harry Chapman married a girl that today you'd go to jail for, and in some states of America you'd be put on the chair. You know, it's a different world. Society changes all the time, and what was okay 20 years ago for an arborist isn't okay today. And as we charge more, and as our industry becomes more professional, there's a greater expectation that we'll behave at a higher level of ethics. And that's an interesting concept in itself. So, of course, that's not always the case.